JobKeeper payment requires casual employers to be with one employer for 12 months. What are you proposing? What is Labor proposing that threshold be changed to?
Well, good morning, Laura. Let's look at the legislation. Let's see what that says. I understand we've been provided that overnight, so we'll be looking at that closely. And we want to work very closely with the government. It was Labor 2 weeks ago that asked for this type of subsidy. We want to make sure that as many people are captured by this subsidy so that it not only helps those workers and their families, but helps the small businesses and other businesses that employ them. So one of the tests we can use is whether, in fact, workers would have reasonably expected to have had ongoing work, rather than a very, very strict definition of casual. I think also it's fair to say that there's a grey area in Australia about whether someone's permanent, part-time and casual, and I think we have to err on the side of making sure that workers who've got a roster and have a pattern of work and an expectation of work continue to be deemed to be part-time and therefore receive that JobKeeper subsidy.
Is it reasonable to put this reasonable expectation into legislation? Wouldn't that create a grey area and potentially more confusion when it comes to casual workers? Doesn't it need to be a bit clearer than that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We have to look at how far we go. I mean, industrial relations legislation is always open to interpretation and contest by courts, however it's constructed. We want to make it as certain as possible, but I think it's fair to say, and we've said this to government, and I think the government's been listening, we want to make sure that this form of support is as broad as possible. Because, for example, if a small business had employed people that it once considered maybe casual, and that's all they employed, then it would be detrimental to the business that they were not seeing any subsidy to those employees. So this is not just about those workers and their families, it's about the businesses that will need that ongoing attachment and ensure that they don't have to pay the entire wage bill because of revenue falling. I think that's really an important part of this. It's not just about workers' support, it's also about the businesses who employ them.
But you're also worried about employers taking this JobKeeper payment but potentially making workers run down their leave. Isn't that a reasonable expectation in these extraordinary times? What are you proposing instead?
I don't think it's fair that the taxpayer of Australia subsidises an employer to pay for what are effectively entitlements already owed to employees. A wage subsidy has never been used in a way to subsidise ongoing entitlements. It's about prospective wages so that employers are relieved from the burden of paying those wages or a large part of those wages, and also ensuring that there's no sort of rorting going on. Now, I think most employers, of course, want to do the right thing. They always do, as do employees. So I think it's fair to say taxpayers of Australia shouldn't be sort of finding a way to subsidise entitlements owed to employees that already exist because of accumulated leave. I think it's also fair to say that some employees and employers will arrange leave, employees taking leave. That's okay, but there should, we just have to watch out for any gaming of this arrangement. That would be.
Let's talk about the awards. Now, the government wants really a one-size-fits-all approach. Labor has suggested that these changes be made by the Fair Work Commission. Now, there are 121 awards. Don't you accept that it would take some time and with some complexity for the Fair Work Commission to do that?
Well, the Fair Work Commission deals with a national wage case and deals with that many awards when it's handing down a decision. So there are ways in which these things can be dealt with by the Fair Work Commission expeditiously. And there's another point here too, Laura, and that is if the legislation has unintended consequences that we don't foresee at the time of enactment, it seems important and fitting that the Fair Work Commission be able to fix those problems once we rise from Parliament, rather than having to come back to Parliament if we actually don't get this right. So I think
Okay, so just to be clear, could this legislation do this one-size-fits-all approach, but give a provision to the Fair Work Commission to essentially fix it on the run in the months ahead without needing to go back to Parliament?
Well, I think that's the tension. I think, and I know Tony Burke's spoken of this, and I think we haven't looked closely at the legislation. As I understand it, it's come to us overnight.
Okay.
But look, of course, the government provides powers and may need to look at legislative changes to get this package out, and Labor is open to that. But let's just be very clear, the Fair Work Commission is an institution that's been around for a century to deal with these matters and deal with things that arise after the enactment of legislation. So I think, of course, we want to make sure this is done expeditiously, but also fairly. So I think it's fair to say, and we submit to the government, if they can enact legislation that provides the Fair Work Commission with the powers not only to deal with many of these matters now, but deal with them if problems arise, that I think is flexible and that will be more expeditious rather than trying to reconvene the Parliament just to fix an instrument that was enacted perhaps a week or two before. Just
very quickly, you're not going to block this plan though, are you?
Well, we've been supportive all along, and you know, Laura, it was 2 weeks ago I asked the Prime Minister in Parliament whether in fact they'd support this subsidy. Initially they didn't want to go down this path, and a week later they announced the package. We welcomed it. And as Anthony Albanese has said, we want to be constructive. We're going to support, obviously, this type of package that will help businesses and workers and their families, but we want to make sure we can get it right, and we want to provide support and advice to the government. We think we know quite a bit about this area, and I hope that the government listens to us so we can improve whatever proposition they're putting forward for us to debate on Wednesday.